They calculated that 10 lychee trees planted at an educational office could improve the teachers' livelihoods. Other local educational offices followed this movement. Hai Duong lychees spread across many northern provinces. After 2 years, many districts and communes had growing symbols of their concern for teachers' welfare. Many other sites organized special funds to assist teachers. These sacrifices and this dedication impressed me. I was particularly touched by the teachers who left their homes in the cities and the deltas to work in our mountainous provinces, such as Sao Bang, Lai Chau, and Lang Son. Working conditions were strenuous. The teachers had to motivate families in order to have students. Each class had only a few students, often at different grade levels. Teachers' living conditions in the mountains were primitive, and they were isolated from the country's general development. Their greatest hardship was to spend decades in the mountains without the chance to return home to the delta. One woman spoke to me in confidence, saying, "For sure, I lost my chance to find a husband." I think we do not yet know all the silent sacrifices of those brothers and sisters. My comrades and I in the ministry leadership understood clearly the crucial role of teachers. Our troops had been decisive on the battlefield. Now, our teachers were warriors on a new front. Their task was rebuilding the nation to bring about a highly educated, skilled, and spirited populace. We examined our system and policies regarding teachers and saw that our ministry's management was weaker than staff in other governmental branches. We researched quality and professional status to implement a policy of salaries and allowances. Persuading the government, the other ministries, and branches was difficult because the educational system included so many people. Education was the country's largest branch after the army in terms of personnel. These days, the situation is different. Finally, at the end of 1983, the state decided to readjust educational salaries and address other systemic policy issues, with the most important question being seniority. Many working in the educational system still mention this as the turning point in educational reform. To honor teachers and encourage their spirit, the ministry and the Vietnam Educators' Union proposed that the Council of Ministers choose November 20th each year for Vietnam Teachers' Day. We also suggested the state create titles, People's Teacher and Merit Teacher, for those who had taught for many years and had made significant contributions to the educational system. When I arrived at the Ministry of Education, the Politburo was finishing Decision 14 about education. Prime Minister Pham Van Dong had educational expertise and a commitment to the profession, as did Comrade De Hu. The Politburo announced its decision on January 11, 1979. We in the ministry's leadership spent considerable time studying Decision 14. Which contained basic guidelines for building a progressive, socialist educational system. Even now, to my thinking, that decision's major points still have value. To implement Decision 14, we had to examine the actual situations on site and then establish appropriate objectives, content, and methodologies. To date, we still have not yet properly achieved that major point, for some areas of our educational system remain heavily dogmatic and willful. Education is a difficult and complicated field because its realm encompasses an individual's development from early years to maturity. For this reason, to establish correct guidelines, in particular, curricula and methodologies, we relied on the Institute of Educational Science and assigned to it additional, highly trained professionals. Comrade Vo Thuan No was responsible for the institute along with Pham Minh Hac and Pham Tad Dong, who had doctorates in psychology, and Ha the Ngu and Pham Van Hoen, who also had doctorates. Later, in 1985, some comrades criticized this work of educational reform and declared it a failure. I think that evaluation was unfair, inaccurate, and partisan. Comparing the earlier curriculum and textbooks with the reformed ones makes clear the later material's progressive qualities. On the other hand, Decision 14 Inch's salient point was that the system needed to find ways to internalize its guiding principles, study in combination with practice. Comprehensive education in intellectual areas, morality, physical abilities, and aesthetics. And vocational training for workers and professionals. We still have not properly implemented these important principles of Decision 14. In 1981, I was introduced and elected to the party's Central Committee. This acknowledged my contribution to the nation's work in general and simultaneously added to my responsibilities. In 1982, Deputy Minister Bui Ton Kiat passed away, and Comrade Y Nagong Nik Dam left to become president of the Dak Lak People's Committee. The ministry was assigned two new, young deputy ministers, Comrades Luong Nok Ton and Tran Zon Nhi. In the summer of 1983, representatives from across the educational system met at Sam Son, Thanh Hoa Province. We agreed on the Sam Son announcement, which introduced educational points into actual school activities, particularly into vocational training. After that meeting, an ebullient atmosphere spread across the educational system. Every region established a technical center for general vocational training, built factory schools, and planted experimental agricultural fields as well as gardens for traditional medicine. All teachers and students both studied and did manual labor. The state undertook a major initiative of tree planting called Green Cover for Bare Hills. In 1984, the Ministry of Education worked with the Ministry of Forestry to plant 14 million trees, one tree for each student, achieving our goal within a year. I went on a tour of schools in Quang Tri Province, where the war's destruction had been momentous. I was delighted to find Con Tien and Tan Lam schools surrounded by forests of young trees, which the students and teachers had planted. In addition to production, we instituted a savings movement, contribute bits of paper, collect bottles and cans, and gather duck feathers. The country's economic situation was dire. This program educated our students in community spirit and assisted the school's economic viability. Administrators and parents were supportive. Yet with such a widespread movement, how could we avoid shortcomings? Unfortunately, instead of seeing the movement's larger meaning, some people intervened and stopped the students' activities because these initiatives were beyond the very strict socio-political economic limits enforced by the economic police. At a time when we had an extremely rigorous model of socialism. In 1985, we finished preparations for instituting basic educational reform, although some tasks remained, in particular pedagogical training. This step required early intervention. Since we needed to move fast, we decided to take a step-by-step approach in switching textbooks for the primary level and the beginning of the secondary level. Implementation of educational reform began in 1985 and was to last until 1991 for the first full cycle. We planned to complete and consolidate the work in a second cycle. Of course, the situation in Vietnam changed markedly at the end of 1986 with renovation and the shift to a socialist market economy. Education faced new tests and new demands. During my 10 years as minister, I paid constant attention to education in industrial areas. I felt we must train the workers' children in order to maintain a strong class of industrial laborers. I visited the Honorable Gai and Cam Pha mines as well as the Tai Nguyen steel factory to guide and encourage expansion of the ministry's education guidelines. I was also attentive to ethnic minority areas. During my tenure, the ministry established directives for a system of on-site boarding schools for ethnic minorities in provinces, districts, and communes. These schools saved ethnic minority students from walking dozens of kilometers to school each day. I also concentrated on the role of women within the ministry. More than 80% of the teachers in the general school system were women. Shouldn't we also have a large number of women administrators? Thus, the Ministry of Education announced a directive. Every level of administration from local schools to school systems to universities must have women in the leadership. Through this decision, women administrators became eligible for appointments and had access to further self-development. The educational emulation movement was one of the most effective and enduring emulation movements for enhancing patriotism. In 1964, President Ho had instituted the emulation model, teach well, study well. Later, in his last letter to the educational system, Ho Chi Minh counseled, even when facing difficulties everywhere, you must continue the emulation campaign to teach well and study well. President Ho had a deep understanding of education's social function. He would mention the ancient saying, "For a legacy in a decade, plant trees. For a legacy in a century, nourish the people." I often visited Bac Li, a poor area of the Midlands with a model school in the nation's emulation movement. Bac Li's school had 2 levels, elementary and general, in a simple building. The students were gaunt, yet their attention to their studies and the seriousness of the school's activities touched me. Many teachers from this school received additional training and became staff in the Ministry of Education and the Institute for Scientific Education, while its students became staff and workers in their ancestral villages. During our work to expand education, we relied on experience from other socialist countries, in particular the Soviet Union and the Democratic Republic of Germany, East Germany, where we sent many staff for training in scientific areas, including pedagogy and psychology. I had a special, collegial relationship with Margot Honecker, the Minister of Education for the Democratic Republic of Germany. She was a skilled, committed educator. We Vietnamese drew from the German experience in vocational training for our workers' educational program. For curricula and textbooks, we relied primarily on Soviet experience and, in part, on that of France. Cuba was a new socialist country. Our Cuban friends had a progressive outlook. They had decided that the party and state's first task was to emphasize education. Visitors to Cuba often went to Youth Island, where students both studied and worked. There, thousands of Cuban youth continued their studies and planted fruit for export. This was indeed impressive. Well-nourished pupils learned on site in a wholesome school. Here was a pleasing point. Our Cuban friends said they had picked up their educational model, study and work, from Vietnam. They brought the model home and spread it with good results. We had established that model in 1974 and 1975, when the need for older rural youth to study and work was enormous. Older rural students lived too far from the tertiary schools in the provincial or district towns to continue their studies. Students at the model tertiary Hoa Binh Province Socialist Labor School both studied and learned a trade, thereby achieving the technical skills they needed to make a living. This school concentrated on production of cassava, the local agricultural crop appropriate to land in that area. Older students lived at the site and returned home for the summer. These schools delighted me. I visited them often to observe the students' study practice and living conditions. Many localities used this model, including Phu Cu School in Hung Nguyen Province as well as Tan Lam and Con Tien schools in Quang Tri Province. Students from these schools became good workers. However, building and managing these study and work boarding schools required huge efforts by local authorities and the provincial educational system. I regret that we have abandoned this excellent educational focus in what I worry will become a budget move that saved money but compromised quality and distanced us from the goal of equality in education. In 1984, we were preparing to expand our educational reforms, but the ministry's budget had no line item for this activity. When I reported the budget shortage to Premier Pham Van Dong, he shook his head in sympathy. "If you can do it without money," he said, "you are truly smart." At this time, living conditions for the ministry's office staff were difficult. Many officials did additional paid work outside their official responsibilities. Deputy Minister Tran Zon Nhi noticed that these secondary jobs dissipated our staff members' energy so that they were not concentrating on the ministry's work. He and others in the ministry discussed with me the idea of establishing the Educational Services Company as a focal point for the school's production output according to the directive, "Take productive labor into the schools." These staff members collected funds from other staff to provide part of the company's initial capital. Tran Zon Nhi established a program with 10 points describing appropriate activities for schools having the means and ability. The ministry would provide guidance and assistance through the Educational Services Company. The company built a kiln to produce pottery. Early efforts were successful. Many comrades in the educational system and other branches praised the product's pottery, educational materials, kindergarten toys, etc. The atmosphere in participating schools was effervescent. Nowadays, people reading these sentences will say, "Why mention activities, which are so petty?" However, we must remember the circumstances at that time. Our national economic policy was extremely strict and rigorous. We were desperately poor. People had nothing. Anyone making even the smallest profit from a creative enterprise suffered from police watchers and became the topic of malicious gossip. Any ministries wanting to take initiatives also met with difficulties and blockage. The economic police noticed that the Ministry of Education was extremely active in finishing one project and starting another. Police officers would visit, to ask about our health. Staff working in the Educational Services Company and I lost a great deal of time, greeting these visitors and reporting on those student projects. The police visitors' thinking was outdated. During inspections, these officers would remain silent if they saw someone making a profit, but as soon as they heard of money lost in a trade, they looked for serious shortcomings. Everyone knows that one always wants to make a profit in business, but equally, it is unrealistic to think one will profit immediately. The economic police demanded that I dismiss this person and then that person so these staff members could have their situations solved. I refused because I knew these brothers and sisters had done nothing wrong. They had only followed the ministry's directives. Thus, the ministry was responsible for protecting them. My resolute attitude on this matter brought me countless problems. Even now, as I think about it, I still believe my attitude was correct. If I have any regret, it is that I could not completely protect all the people under me. I thank comrades Tran Zon Nhi, Don Van D, and many other brothers and sisters who supported me when countless obstacles were scattered in my path. My greatest regret is that the movement to introduce work and vocational training into schools, which had only just burst forth, suffered from such dousings of icy water. The negative results remain today. Many comrades say, perhaps your views were ahead of the times, like Uncle Kim Nok-s with his agricultural piecework. They made him miserable because he saw a solution earlier than everyone else. But now, everyone accepts his view and says he was correct. Anything new often suffers from critics looking for ways to obstruct the initiative. Yet only if we have people willing to look ahead can we have change, economic development, and progress. That's the law of life and of economic and intellectual development. I finished 2 terms as Minister of Education with greater understanding of our country's social situation, added experience in state management, and wonderful memories of time with the staff and teachers in our educational system. I am proud to have given my greatest effort to complete my assignment. Many problems remained, and I left tasks unfinished. We still had no directives in place to solve basic problems. Yet renovation placed extensive demands on the education our people needed for the nation's development. My greatest personal gain was a deepening understanding about the importance of education for the nation and for each individual. Essential to establishing equal rights for every person is the right to study and secure the opportunity to grow and work toward a future life. I also understood more deeply a teaching we can perhaps attribute to Elder Phan Chau Trin. Expand the people's intellectual standard, adjust their intellectual standard, and support improved living standards. That theory still has value today, when the need is even clearer and more pressing. If we do not develop our nation's intellectual standard to its greatest strength, if we do not have adequate intellectual standards for our schools, then we cannot develop our country. Our people will not be able to stay abreast of other peoples from across the world. In 1984, my husband Kang began his retirement. He had high blood pressure and was not as healthy as before. For years, he had been an army officer wrapped up in his work. When he retired, he became active in our neighborhood and served as general secretary of a model party cell. He was much beloved by his comrades. Kang would make careful preparations for party cell meetings, which were held at our house. I would tease him, saying, "You plan more carefully for the local party cell than I do for a meeting of the party central committee." He'd laugh and say, "Living with a purpose brings me joy." To support my work, he shouldered all the family tasks except the cooking. I was very fortunate to have a life partner, who was constantly empathetic and loving. At the end of 1984, we had especially good news. Our daughter Mai married, and a month later, our son Thang also married. The other two families were both from the Hanoi intelligentsia. Late 1986 brought an important turning point in our country's post-war development. During the years after the war, we had a major socio-economic crisis. Dogmatic thinking and the extended rationing system brought endless difficulties. People's ordinary lives were hard for many reasons. Food and other necessities were in extremely short supply. The directives forbidding small markets were supposed to limit speculation and protect the state's management system with equal allotments. However, in reality, those directives hampered the circulation of goods and led to serious limitations in production. Life became increasingly stressful, while the authorities became even stricter in forbidding markets. Some officials left the city for their ancestral villages, where relatives gave them a little rice. Other officials went on assignment and returned with a kilo of tea. The economic police invited such people in for questioning and confiscated their rice and tea. My close friends and the mid and high-level staff at the Ministry of Education received moldy rice mixed with cassava and cereal for our rations. Each month, an entire family received only 1 kilo of meat mixed with fat. Given the dreadful living situation, it is no wonder that people sought a way out. Many cooperatives in the countryside implemented piecework, so that farmers could do some work only for themselves instead of for the collective. Leaders in many local areas could no longer stand with their arms folded. Officials in Long An province put a price on salary. In reality, they erased the backward and useless rationing system. It was impossible to silence the word of mouth among the populace about these activities. Indeed, these initiatives encouraged serious work in preparation for the 6th Communist Party Congress in late 1986. Comrades in the party leadership divided up the local sites to visit. Party General Secretary Trong Chin went to Ho Chi Minh City to see what was happening at factories. Then he went to Long An, the area that had dared to break the economic rules and was actually developing economically. The party heard what the people said about their need for viable livelihoods. The party leadership sent the first draft of its report for the party congress to the lower levels. Lively and sometimes contentious discussions ensued until the final draft, which became a true report, looking straight at the truth. From that base came renovation, the major political and economic shift in late 1986 that broke the prolonged jam and created Vietnam's new, vital season of invigorated economic development. Here was an achievement of all our people, the entire party, and a deep lesson. We must listen to the people. If we stray from the people, we will face difficulties. If we stay close to the people, then we can build strength. In 1986, Comrade Nguyen Van Linh, the person regarded as the decisive leader for renovation, was elected party general secretary. How could Nguyen Van Linh have seen this situation so early and so clearly? My guess is this. An important part of Nguyen Van Linh's political work for many years during both the French War and the American War was as an underground revolutionary in Saigon, Cho Lan, a very dynamic city. During those years, he would have had direct exposure to the city's vigorous market economy with its many classes of people. He understood the people's wishes and strengths. I think the lessons of the Sixth Party Congress will always remain timely for our country's development. People in the international community know about the party's renovation policy. Indeed, renovation has become a word used worldwide in reference to Vietnam. Renovation is rather like the phrase, "Dia bien phué," which meant, a telling blow, and was in vogue after the Vietnamese victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu. In the middle of 1987, I moved to the party's central-level foreign relations department. Once again, I returned to people-to-people diplomacy. 12. Returning to people-to-people diplomacy. In 1987, I returned to my forte of 20 years before. When I first became active in foreign relations in the 1950s, I worked in people-to-people diplomacy, representing the Youth Union, the Women's Union, and the Asian African Solidarity Committee in an effort to encourage people from other countries to support our opposition to U.S. intervention in the South. Later, I was appointed Foreign Minister of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, of the Republic of South Vietnam and shifted to state diplomacy. Now, in 1987, I was returning to people-to-people diplomacy as Deputy Director of the Party Foreign Relations Department and President of the Union of Organizations for Peace, Solidarity, and Friendship with All Nations, the Union. Simultaneously, in terms of the state, I served as chair of the National Assembly's Foreign Relations Committee. From personal experience, I expected shifting from state diplomacy to people-to-people diplomacy would not bring new hurdles but would, instead, allow greater flexibility and more opportunities for initiative. In our country, the people as a whole and the state administration have the same objective. In earlier years, our shared goal had been to oppose the imperialists in order to secure independence and unification. Now, as I took on this new position, our goal was to protect and rebuild our nation. The major difference was the focus of my activities, since people-to-people diplomacy involved mobilizing people in other nations for our cause, while state diplomacy focused on building relationships between governments. In our system, these two lines of diplomatic work support each other and create the special character of Vietnamese diplomacy in modern times. In general, most people wish for peace and freedom and would, if asked, take a stand on the side of justice. In contrast, the administrations of capitalist, imperialist countries support the profiting class and the rights of special interest cliques. These governments often work in opposition to the people's wishes. They play the role of divide and conquer, often leading people away from their own true interest and away from the true interest of others from different religious or racial groups. We know that working with ordinary people is very important because the people do have the power to force their governments to change policy. We know the French people's movement against the French war in Vietnam, and then a similar American people's movement helped force the French and US administrations to end their wars of aggression. I never studied in a school of international relations but instead moved from working as an organizer of local political activities in Saigon to mobilizing among the people. Activism in people-to-people diplomacy was appropriate for me, since the work still involved mobilizing, but the scope was worldwide. People-to-people diplomacy requires good arguments and the empathy needed to persuade others, yet you must remain rigorous in your position. Most important is honesty with colleagues. I never spoke only about our people's good qualities and achievements. I would also note the deficiencies that were readily apparent. For that reason, when something was not clear to our foreign friends, they would seek me out. They would say, "I trust me. Ben, I must ask her." Women are easily moved by the pain and injustice others endure. However, youth, workers, intellectuals, and artists, each one of them has his or her social context. To be effective, our struggle for freedom, independence, and the right to live had to affect each person emotionally. The worldwide people's solidarity movement supporting Vietnam's just cause, particularly during the American War of Aggression, was the largest international movement ever seen at that time. It strongly affected the American administration's policies. Important to that movement were contributions from our people-to-people diplomacy army, which worked continuously for several decades. We can say that, during those war years, our Vietnamese warriors on the diplomatic front left their footprints everywhere, from the coldest areas near the North Pole to the smallest islands in the Pacific Ocean. We were present whenever we had an invitation and the wherewithal to travel. This was possible because of huge assistance from friendly countries, the international democratic organizations, and the organizations for Asian-Pacific solidarity. They supported us in spirit and with funding so that Vietnamese delegations could take our message to other nations. A key guideline for many international democratic organizations may seem surprising. Those directly active in the struggle receive priority for assistance. As a result, during the war, our delegations from the South and the North did not spend Vietnamese funds for their worldwide activism. Since I was returning to a familiar environment, I felt no reservations, although the situation in our country had changed completely. My comrades and I in the Union of Organizations for Peace, Solidarity and Friendship with all nations concentrated on opening bilateral friendship associations. Our country had achieved independence and reunification, and we had unified our administrative structure. Now, although we were attentive to state diplomacy, we concentrated on organizing internationally with our supporters. We sent delegations to visit other countries, received organizations working in solidarity with Vietnam, and attended meetings supporting the other nations that continued to struggle. In 1982, the Asian Pacific Solidarity Committee elected me as vice president, a position I continue to hold. Hence, 2 or 3 times a year, I would take part in meetings, which opposed apartheid in South Africa, supported Palestine, and opposed the plots to invade Cuba. Our friends in those settings appreciated hearing our voice, for Vietnam had become a symbol and a model for other countries. For many years, the Soviet Union, the German Democratic Republic, and Eastern European socialist countries contributed both political and financial support to the international democratic organizations attending these meetings. When the Soviet bloc split apart, the international democratic organizations, including the Committee for Asian-African Solidarity, faced many difficulties. People-to-people diplomacy in the Soviet Union and Eastern European nations was active and inspiring between 1970 and 1980, offering financial and psychological support for international solidarity. We had portraits of socialism, perhaps idealized, with its many beautiful details from the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. These inspired revolutionary movements in general as well as socialist solidarity movements opposing imperialism and capitalism. Looking back at that period, I wonder whether some of those socialist countries may have made mistakes, which led to their weakening or even disintegration. Still, we should not deny the achievements of those socialist societies, which emphasized care for children and the elderly and where no great distance existed between laborers, officials, and intellectuals. In 1985, many party members in other countries were delighted as perestroika began to restructure the Soviet Union. They wanted the Soviet Union to address its shortcomings, develop a long-term base, make secure changes, and become even stronger. At about that same time, in 1986, we in Vietnam accepted the huge shift to renovation, which we continue to follow today. We looked straight at the truth. We were determined to dismantle the conservatism that had stymied us. Our renovation and the Soviet Union's perestroika occurred at about the same time, but the situation in the two countries was entirely different. The causes of the crises were different, the solutions were different, and the results were different. I do not want to go deeply into the internal affairs of a friendly country. The leaders of each country are responsible for answering to their own people. I hope only that the former Soviet Union and the former socialist countries will remain strong, loyal, and trusted friends and will develop in ways honoring their people's interests and their heroic heritage. We Vietnamese are delighted and proud of our achievements during renovation, but we have also only just overcome a serious socio-economic crisis. When renovation began, we faced many challenges to our independence and sovereignty. Now, we are on the way to regaining prosperity for our nation and happiness for our people. While on that route, we needed our friends' support and the spirit of international solidarity. During my tenure as chair of the National Assembly's Foreign Relations Committee, several other comrades and I took part in conferences of the Interparliamentary Union, IPU. At that time, the hot issues in people's minds about Vietnam were Cambodia and our detaining and re-educating officers from the former Saigon administration. Many people in several countries admired Vietnam for generously helping Cambodians escape the Pol Pot regime's genocide. These people understood that we had carried out a noble international duty while simultaneously protecting our own independence and sovereignty, which we had just achieved after years of sacrifice and hardship. The Cambodian people faced genocide such as humanity may have rarely seen. Vietnam was the only country willing to sacrifice to save its friend. No one else lent a hand. We were wholehearted in helping our Cambodian friends, and we were also determined to fight off what we saw as another new plot. Hence, we were determined also to protect our country from Khmer Rouge incursions into southwestern Vietnam, when we had only just achieved control over our own borders. However, some nations misunderstood our magnanimity and the meaning of our sacrificial struggle. The United States seized this opportunity to heighten its embargo against Vietnam. We had to explain our principles so our friends understood. Afterwards, people and even governments of Western countries recognized our purpose, saying, "We did not completely understand Vietnam. If you friends had not stopped the genocide in Cambodia, no one knows what would have happened to the Cambodian people." For years, we had to clench our teeth and pay a high price in the international community for having helped our friends in Cambodia. I remember one ECOSOC conference in Bangkok, where representatives from Singapore, Thailand, and other nations accused Vietnam of invasion, imperialism, and colonialism. Usually, I would refute their accusations and repeat that the Vietnamese people's war had lasted 30 years. I would explain our reasons for helping the Cambodian people. This time, some people understood. They said, "It's so good to be imperialists and colonialists like Vietnam." Those of a realistic bent could understand why we had detained officers from the Saigon administration for re-education. They knew that, in 1975, we did not wipe out the Saigon army but, instead, only dispersed it. Those forces could have recovered. If we had not detained the Saigon officers, we would have left behind a dangerous military infrastructure for any new administration. Later, we gradually released the officers. In some cases, we held officers for a needlessly long time and some treatment situations were improper, leading to negative outcomes. At first, some delegations at the Inter-Parliamentary Union, IPU, denounced Vietnam, even though they accepted that our new administration had not perpetrated a sea of blood or revenge against the defeated. However, after many meetings with us as witnesses, this issue receded. At that time, progressive people found it disconcerting that some representatives from former socialist countries in Eastern Europe spoke out with unsparing accusations against the old, socialist system. Among them were doctors and lawyers, who had benefited from the socialist educational system. Nevertheless, they denounced the socialist system's support for education and training. I remember one IPU meeting in Bulgaria. I was very moved when a demure Japanese woman spoke. She stated her name, identified herself as a communist, and spoke about the situation in Japan. She spoke calmly about the mistakes that had occurred in the former socialist countries of Eastern Europe. Then she said one must analyze the historical source of that phenomenon to evaluate it correctly with understanding and fairness. Her open, self-confident attitude after several reckless, revengeful speeches encouraged those at the meeting to regain their balance. At that time, an important duty of the National Assembly's Foreign Relations Committee was to encourage other countries and U.S. organizations sympathetic to Vietnam to demand that the U.S. government lift its embargo. Many National Assembly delegations and people's organizations went to the United States to lobby. Here, I should also mention Americans working to normalize relations between the United States and Vietnam, in particular the Aspen Institute and John McAuliffe, director of the U.S. Indochina Reconciliation Project. At this same time, the Union shifted its political activities to include economic and cultural cooperation appropriate to renovation. We suggested to the government that we establish the People's Aid Coordinating Committee, PACCOM, to facilitate assistance from international non-governmental organizations, INGOs. As far as I know, from that time during the embargo until now, INGO activities have given substantial assistance so that impoverished Vietnamese can improve their livelihoods. As I have noted, after 1975 we entered a severe socio-economic crisis, when our country was at its lowest post-war ebb and as some of the other socialist countries were disintegrating. Many well-intentioned international friends were worried. They were unable to see how Vietnam could develop. I had two close friends, Gabriel and Joyce Kolko. He was a professor of economics while she was a historian. They were leftist Americans who had published a famous book, Anatomy of a War. Many Vietnamese said of that book, their evaluation of the situation and their analysis of the American and Vietnamese principles are similar to ours. In about 1982, the Kolkos returned to visit Vietnam. After that, we invited them many times, but they were too busy. Now, the sad news is that both Kolkos have passed on. While the Kolkos were active, they sent letters to some friends in Vietnam, worrying that Vietnam would abandon socialism and become like the Soviet Union and China. They feared the capitalist class would develop and counter the people's interests. Their assessment resembles that of some other good friends. However, given the complicated new situation, These friends surely cannot understand all the realities in our country. Meanwhile, other friends who supported us during the war were despondent because Vietnam followed socialism instead of nationalist independence like many nations in the region. It's fair to say that after the war, there were some shifting relationships and even splits between us and some international friends. Some wanted us to turn to the right, while others wanted us to bend to the left. This is easy to understand. Other friends remained calm and objective. They thought Vietnam's choice was the Vietnamese people's decision. Those friends only wanted us to have a better life worthy of the sacrifices and hardships borne during many years of war. In 1989, 2 years after beginning work with the Union, I suffered a major loss. My husband Kang passed away from illness. At the time, our son Thang was studying in Czechoslovakia. It all happened suddenly. On December 24, a Sunday, Kang and I were talking about our 2 grandchildren. That evening, we took Kang, in an emergency run, to 108 Hospital, which had treated him before. I wanted to stay over at the hospital to look after him, but he insisted I go home to rest. His character was like that. He would never trouble anyone, not even his wife or children. The next morning I arrived to visit him before going to a National Assembly session. He was very weak and could only say, "I am so tired." The doctor arrived to give him an injection for his heart. With that, Kang stopped breathing. And so, our plans, simple hopes, deep attachment, and our thought that, after I retired, we would take better care of each other and travel as tourists to different sites, all that disappeared in a flash. I had many friends and comrades around me. They were endlessly sympathetic, but I still felt truly alone and bereft. That pain is endless. Until now, I do not have anyone with whom I can pour out every thought, confidence, and worry, and from whom I can receive encouragement and the words of comfort that I need. Life is like that. What can we do? 13. The Vice Presidency. After Kang's death, my friends in Ho Chi Minh City urged me to return to the home I left. I had close friends in Ho Chi Minh City from my activist days opposing the French. In addition, I had other close friends from the former South who had regrouped to the North following the Geneva Agreements. They had returned home after liberation in 1975 and urged me also to return. 2 of my brothers Nguyen Dong Ha and Nguyen Dong Ho were also in Ho Chi Minh City. Ha, the next youngest of my siblings, had been an activist in the South during the American period. The Saigon authorities imprisoned him on Con Dao Island, where they held him in a tiger cage for nearly 7 years. Ha had been separated from our family for the entire 21 years that Vietnam was divided into South and North. He was very keen on reuniting our family and particularly wanted to be close to second eldest sister. We too had so many shared memories from our childhood. Ha was 3 years younger. At age 16, he joined the Saigon Revolutionary Youth Union, where he was an organizer until his arrest in late 1968. Ho, who had earned his master's degree in mechanical engineering, returned after liberation from his studies in Russia to work in Ho Chi Minh City. In 1990, my son Thang went to Ho Chi Minh City to work and also to prepare for my return. I had been based in Hanoi for 36 years, ever since regrouping to the north in 1954. That was a longer time than my youth and years of activism in the South. I come to understand quite a bit about northern Vietnam and had many close friends here from my years working at the Central Level Women's Union, the Reunification Committee, the Foreign Ministry, the party's Central Level External Relations Committee, and the National Assembly. But, in truth, the memories of my youth and those years when my parents and siblings were all together in the South had created my most deeply felt memories, which I could not forget. This was my thinking in the beginning of 1992, when Party General Secretary Du Moi came to see me. He told me the comrades in the Politburo had decided to nominate me at the next National Assembly session to serve as the country's vice president. This news caught me totally by surprise. My first reaction was to refuse because I was already 65, well beyond the established and required retirement age of 55 for women. Besides, I already had plans to live in Ho Chi Minh City. I thanked Comrade Dumoy, saying, "It's regrettable that when I was still young and could have perhaps made a substantial contribution, you comrades didn't evaluate me accurately. But now, they reached the age when I must retire." To tell the truth, this was hardly a deliberated response, but instead an honest exposure of the feelings I had held for a long time. But then I thought again. I had always worked for our nation and for no other purpose. In the end, I agreed to accept this new duty and continue working. My children had no opinions about my decision. "Mother," they said, "it's up to you." Mai and Thang had never relied on their parents' positions. This was true when I served as Minister of Education and true when I was Vice President. But Ha was not happy. He spoke half in jest, half in truth. "I want you to lose this election for the National Assembly," he said. "That way, you'll avoid selection for Vice President. Then you can return and live with us." But I did not follow Ha's wish. A few years later, Ha passed on while I was still working in Hanoi. And so, I continued working for 10 more years, for 2 terms as the country's Vice President. I was 65 when I accepted the vice presidency. I believe that I carried out the responsibilities given me both clearly and well. Because of this, I've given some thought to our country's policy regarding women officials, because the operative assumption is that women over the age of 55 or 60 absolutely cannot produce good work. During my tenure, I was fortunate to receive many important assignments. Yet countless other older and younger women from before me and after me had excellent qualifications. They were not inferior to the men, but unfortunately their abilities were not recognized. They earned but have not received their just place in society. I believe that, in order to develop any nation, we must create conditions whereby women can both tend their families and contribute to the nation's management. This need is particularly true for a country like Vietnam, which has endured so many struggles to create a cultured, contented life for its people. Establishing a family and tending our children are extremely important responsibilities. Women cannot neglect that work, but the care of children is also society's responsibility. We need a policy to assist women with the practicalities of rearing children. Simultaneously, the state should increase participation of women in the nation's management. It is utterly indispensable that we have guidelines and policies to spread this change across all areas of society. Until now, our policies regarding officials have not affirmed the abilities of women. Thus, we have not yet created the conditions needed for women to advance. Yet now, today, we are in the 21st century. Many activists across the world are saying, this is the century of women. I hope Vietnamese women will make great advancements. I hope Vietnamese society will give women a place worthy of their great achievements and potential. When I began to serve as vice president, President Le Duc An assigned me to assist him with tasks in diplomacy, education, health, patriotic emulation campaigns, and, later, with judicial affairs. In general, these tasks were not unusual for me. I often represented the president in receiving diplomatic credentials. I don't remember how many newly arrived ambassadors to Vietnam I met when they came to present their credentials. Our role in the international arena had improved substantially by the beginning of 1996. We had withdrawn all our troops from Cambodia, the United States had lifted its embargo, and we had normalized our diplomatic relations with the major powers. Many countries had already established normalized relations with Vietnam but did not yet have embassies in Hanoi. Now, they asked to open embassies. Other countries had only recently established diplomatic relations with us. Our foreign policy was to diversify our foreign relations and increase our multilateral relationships. We wanted to be friends with all nations in support of peace, freedom, and social progress in order to implement our important mission building and developing our country. After the presentation of credentials, I had a chance to talk with the ambassadors. Since I had been active in diplomatic relations for a relatively long time, I knew a little about the situation in many countries and the relationship between those countries and Vietnam. As a result, my conversations with ambassadors were both delightful and useful to both sides. In addition to my diplomatic activities, I also met with heads of state, government officials from other countries, and many foreign people's delegations of intellectuals, youth, and women. These meetings included the friends who had supported us during our resistance wars against France and the United States. The comrade in charge of the office of the president counseled me. "Older sister," he said, "now that you are a representative of the state, you should not meet with delegations unless they are from states or governments." I did not agree. Why should it be that way? Our diplomacy was revolutionary diplomacy. Our national tradition is to be true to our friends. I took this point up in a discussion with President Le Duc An, who completely agreed with me. Beginning in 1991, the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie organized meetings of its leaders every 2 years. I was assigned to attend these meetings. I went to one conference on Mauritius Island, 1993, with the theme, Unity in Diversity, to another in Benin, 1995, with the theme, Dialogue, Cooperation, and Development, and to the one in Canada, 1999, with the theme, Youth. Since I knew French, this assignment was not difficult. Most of the organization's members were former French colonies, which were especially sympathetic with Vietnam, while the two large countries France and Canada also gave Vietnam special consideration. Even though conference representatives arrived with different objectives, the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie gathered together more than 50 countries and territories into a forceful concentration of nations. Everyone spoke French and knew about and understood French culture. The delegation from Vietnam used these meetings to concentrate on cooperative relationships with France and Canada in economics, culture, and education. On another front, we wanted to increase solidarity and cooperation with the African members that shared the goal of protecting national independence and developing our own countries. I first met French President Jacques Chirac in the Benin Republic. The Vietnamese and the French had developed a special friendship after our shared history. Uncle Ho, other Vietnamese leaders, and I all had many close friends in France. President Chirac received me with great warmth. On that occasion, I raised this question. Why had France placed Vietnam on its 4th priority level for commerce? There's no reason, President Chirac said. He immediately called over his special assistant and said, "Shift Vietnam to the 3rd level." With that, he addressed our request. After that conversation, I had many chances to meet President Chirac, who was always solicitous. We in the diplomatic corps knew Mr. Chirac was a member of the Union pour un Mouvement Populaire, a center-rightist party. However, his diplomatic principles were strong and progressive. He was determined not to join the United States in its war of invasion against Iraq. President Chirac had a sympathetic attitude toward Vietnam. Some people said President Chirac's response to Vietnam was better than that of another country's president, whose party was regarded as leftist. In 1994, I visited West Africa, particularly the Francophone countries that I had visited during our resistance war against the United States. At the request of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I went to Algeria, Mali, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, and Senegal to improve on our traditional solidarity. These countries had developed considerably compared with 20 years before, but not as much as Asian countries. In general, they still faced major difficulties, in particular, food shortages. Perhaps one can say they faced the additional challenges that had appeared with globalization. These friends admired Vietnam for our victory over major imperialist nations and our achievements in development. Our delegation included Minister of Health Nguyen Trong Nhan, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Nguyen Dai Nien, and Comrade Ben, Deputy General Director of the Food Company of the North. Our visits were favorable since I had personally made the acquaintance of these countries, presidents and prime ministers when they were foreign ministers. We were received with high honors wherever we went. The presidents of Algeria, Guinea, and Mali had their own airplanes and provided us with travel to our next destination. After this trip, while en route from Senegal to Paris, I had a delightful experience. I sat next to Mr. Jacques Diouf, a Senegalese, who was director of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO. We discussed the world food situation. Mr. Diouf was very direct, asking me, "How is it that not long ago Vietnam was importing food but is now a major exporter of rice?" We discussed many ideas about the difficulties African countries faced in agricultural production. In the end, I told the FAO director that Vietnam wanted to help its friends, but we were still too poor to send agricultural advisors to other countries. We tossed this around and came to an important idea of tripartite cooperation, where Vietnam would contribute the advisors, FAO would provide the major financial assistance for the advisors, and the host country would cover the advisors' on-site living expenses. We agreed the cooperation would begin with Senegal. I returned home, and a month later, a Senegalese agricultural delegation arrived to discuss plans with our Ministry of Agriculture. The two sides quickly settled everything except the entangling question of salaries for the Vietnamese advisors. Several ministries, including the Finance Ministry and the Ministry of Labor, War Invalids, and Social Affairs held that since these were international consultants, their salaries should be high. However, in reality, at that time, we had only a few credentialed agricultural experts. Most of the consultants we could send were only mid-level technicians. In addition, Mr. Diouf and I had envisioned a cooperative project in a spirit of solidarity and mutual assistance. The Prime Minister of Senegal telephoned, asking me to intervene. I phoned directly to Prime Minister Vo Van Kiet. He agreed immediately with my point of view and directed Deputy Prime Minister Nguyen Cong Tan to solve the problem of salaries for Vietnamese agricultural advisors in Senegal. I was delighted to find my initiative backed by a governmental policy, for this project had value not only for our friends but also for us. Further, we had precisely followed a political route by implementing South-South cooperation according to the orientation of the non-aligned movement. 2 years after beginning the cooperation, the Senegalese government was delighted because its rice production had increased 3 to 4 times. Hearing this news, many other countries raised with Vietnam the issue of agricultural cooperation using the Senegalese model. The major diplomatic event I remember most clearly from that time was the 7th meeting of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie in 1997 in Hanoi. The Francophone member nations took turns hosting the conference. We were reluctant when it was Vietnam's turn because this would be our first time hosting a high-level conference. Participants would all be heads of state. We knew we would have trouble with the basics, yet refusing would bring a loss of prestige. And so, in 1995, we joined hands and began to prepare. Most important, we needed a large meeting hall. With assistance from France and Canada, by the beginning of 1997, We had built a conference center at 11 La Hong Phong Street, Hanoi. At that time, this was the city's most spacious meeting hall with suitable accommodations. Other pressing arrangements included preparing conference documents, lodging, meals, and transporting 50 heads of state. The organizing committee headed by Deputy Prime Minister Nguyen Khan saw that every detail was in place according to plan by the opening day of the meeting. By this time, Comrade Le Duc An was no longer president. Comrade Tran Duc Luong had succeeded him. We held the conference opening ceremony at the Soviet Friendship Palace and the working sessions at 11 La Hong Phong. The opening ceremony was a solemn affair. The organizing committee presented its formal welcome and announced the reason for the meeting. Then we had a small performance to welcome the representatives. 20 children, 10 boys and 10 girls between the ages of 10 and 12 came on stage. Dressed in Vietnamese ceremonial robes, they folded their arms across their chests and bowed in the traditional way that Vietnamese children greet their elders. Then the children sang in French, "We children dream of the day." They were so endearing. The distinguished heads of state were delighted. After that, President Tran Duc Luong gave his opening speech in French. Then President Chirac replied on behalf of the guests. 55 state representatives, with most of them presidents or prime ministers, participated in the summit. Many heads of state were visiting Vietnam for the first time. Several representatives said, "They heard so much about Vietnam. They wanted to visit and learn about the people and country so famous for bravery." I was assigned to preside at the meetings since Vietnam was the conference host. Comrade Trinh Duc Du, Vietnam's representative to the Executive Committee of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, returned from Paris to assist me. The conference faced several difficult issues, including the choice of the Secretary-General to succeed Mr. Boutros Ghali, who had completed 2 terms. That question was settled outside in the corridors. The greatest challenge in chairing the meeting was managing the time. In the summits that I had attended, the chair was usually light-handed, especially when the large countries had the floor. As a result, the smaller countries wasted many hours waiting for their turns to speak. Right from the start, I diplomatically encouraged our distinguished guests to honor our program and allotted work times. My attitude was mild and friendly but created additional respect and consideration from the guests for the chair. The meals outside the conference hall were gracious, and travel to sites went smoothly. The reception at the Presidential Palace and the performance in Hanoi's Municipal Theatre both created a good impression. The delegates appreciated Vietnam's national culture and our hospitality. The success of the Hanoi summit of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie helped many countries, including those visiting Vietnam for the first time, understand more about our nation. They saw that Vietnam, a country with a tradition of resisting powerful foreign aggressors, was developing quickly. They perceived that Vietnam had a policy of friendship, cooperation, and openness. Also, they experienced our unique, long-standing culture. Many foreign journalists covering the summit published articles and relayed broadcasts about Vietnam. Perhaps we can say that the 7th summit contributed decisively to lifting Vietnam's status in the international arena. At this meeting, Senegalese President Abdou Diouf thanked our leaders for assistance with great results in agricultural development. The President of Mali made known his wish for assistance.